The invitation came wrapped in laughter. A friendly gesture, they called it, just a bit of fun. Light contact, nothing serious. According to witnesses, the man who extended his hand that afternoon had no idea that some invitations, once offered, cannot be withdrawn. He thought he was proposing entertainment. What he was actually doing, as those present would later recall, was lighting a fuse that would burn for exactly 6 seconds before detonating in a way that would haunt everyone in that room for the rest of their lives. The concept of sparring for fun is a peculiar contradiction. In most endeavors, the line between recreation and reality remains clear. A friendly game of chess differs fundamentally from a tournament match. A casual jog bears no resemblance to an Olympic sprint. But in combat, even when wrapped in the soft gauze of friendship and restraint, something primal lurks beneath the surface. Every fighter knows this truth, though most choose to ignore it. On that particular afternoon, according to reported accounts, one man would learn this lesson in a way that would strip away every comfortable illusion about the nature of controlled violence. The setting was unremarkable, a private training facility, the kind found in any major city where serious martial artists gather away from public scrutiny. Mirrors lined the walls, reflecting the assembled group of practitioners who had finished their formal training for the day. The atmosphere, witnesses would later describe, was relaxed, jovial even. These were not strangers but colleagues, fellow students of combat who had shared sweat and technique over many months. It was in this environment of apparent camaraderie that the suggestion arose. The man who would issue the challenge was himself an accomplished martial artist. Not a champion, perhaps, but someone who had devoted years to his craft. He possessed the kind of confidence that comes from never having been truly tested, the dangerous self-assurance of someone who has sparred enough to feel competent but not sufficient to understand his own limitations. According to those who knew him, he was known for his sense of humor, his easy smile, and his tendency to treat everything as slightly less serious than it actually was. His target that day was someone who had been training quietly in the corner, a compact figure whose reputation preceded him. Though he rarely spoke of his own accomplishments, this was Bruce Lee, already a legend in certain circles though not yet the global icon he would become. In that room, however, he was simply another practitioner, albeit one who moved with an economy of motion that suggested depths not immediately visible on the surface. The challenge, when it came, was delivered with all the casual arrogance of someone who believed their own press. "Come on," the man said, his voice carrying across the training space. "Just for fun. Light contact. I want to see if all these stories about you are true." The words hung in the air like smoke. Several witnesses reported feeling the atmosphere in the room shift, though they couldn't quite articulate why. Lee's response was characteristic of what those who knew him described as his typical demeanor. He demurred initially, suggesting that perhaps it wasn't necessary, that nothing good could come from such a demonstration. But the challenger persisted, his voice taking on the slight edge that creeps in when someone feels their generous offer is being rejected. He began to perform for the small crowd, making jokes about movie fighters and their choreographed techniques. Each comment was designed to create social pressure, to make refusal seem like cowardice rather than wisdom. It was then, according to multiple accounts, that something changed in Lee's expression. Not anger exactly, but a kind of resignation mixed with something else. Those who were watching closely described it as the look of someone who had decided to teach a lesson that couldn't be conveyed through words. He stood slowly, his movements deliberate but unhurried. "Light contact," he repeated, his voice neutral. "Just for fun." The two men moved to the center of the informal circle that had formed. No referee, no formal rules, just an understanding between practitioners that this would be controlled, civilized, a demonstration rather than a fight. The challenger bounced on his feet, throwing a few shadow punches to warm up. Lee stood perfectly still, his hands hanging loosely at his sides. The contrast was striking enough that several observers reported feeling a sudden unease. "Ready when you are," the challenger said, raising his hands in a classic boxing stance. He was grinning, playing to the small audience. This was, in his mind, exactly what he had wanted. A chance to test himself against a legend, with no real stakes beyond bragging rights. What he failed to understand, what would become devastatingly clear in the next 6 seconds, was that for someone like Lee, there was no such thing as sparring without stakes. Every physical encounter was a matter of truth. The first second passed in what witnesses unanimously described as an eerie stillness. Lee hadn't adopted any recognizable fighting stance. He simply stood there, weight evenly distributed, watching. The challenger threw a probing jab, the kind of half-hearted technique meant to establish distance and timing. It never landed. Not because Lee blocked it or slipped it in any dramatic fashion, but because he simply wasn't there when it arrived. The movement was so subtle that several observers weren't even sure he had moved at all. The second saw the challenger's confidence begin to fracture. His grin remained, but something in his eyes had changed. He threw a combination this time, a jab-cross pattern that any competent boxer would recognize. Again, Lee seemed to simply not be where the punches were aimed. But this time, observers noticed something else. As the cross whistled past where his head had been, Lee's hand moved, not in attack, but in what looked almost like a casual gesture, as if brushing away a fly. It was in the third second that the nature of the encounter revealed itself. The challenger, perhaps frustrated by his inability to make contact, perhaps sensing that he was being made to look foolish, abandoned the pretense of light contact. His next punch came with real intention behind it, a hook aimed at Lee's ribs, with enough force to hurt. This time, Lee didn't evade. According to the witnesses, what happened next occurred so quickly that there was disagreement about the exact sequence of events. Lee's hand intercepted the hook, not with a block, but with what one observer described as a redirecting touch. The challenger's own momentum was turned against him, sending him slightly off balance. In the same motion, Lee's other hand moved, not in a strike, but in another of those almost gentle touches, this time to the challenger's extended arm. The effect was immediate and disturbing. The challenger's arm went limp, dropping to his side as if the power had been suddenly switched off. The fourth second brought panic. The challenger, now fighting with one functional arm, threw a wild haymaker with his good hand. It was the kind of desperate, technically poor technique that trained fighters resort to only when skill has abandoned them. Lee's response was to step inside the arc of the punch, so close that several witnesses thought he was embracing his opponent. But there was no embrace. Instead, there was another of those precise touches, this time to a spot just below the challenger's shoulder. The second arm dropped. By the fifth second, the challenger stood effectively helpless, both arms hanging uselessly at his sides. The jovial atmosphere of moments before had evaporated entirely. No one was smiling now. The small crowd watched in silent discomfort as the challenger tried to raise his arms and failed, the commands from his brain seemingly unable to reach his limbs. His eyes, witnesses reported, showed the kind of fundamental fear that comes from experiencing something that shouldn't be possible. It was in the sixth second that Lee demonstrated why he had initially declined the invitation. With both of the challenger's arms neutralized, he had complete freedom to do whatever he wished. Everyone watching knew this. The challenger knew this. The vulnerability was absolute. Lee stepped back, creating distance, and for a moment that stretched like eternity, he simply looked at his helpless opponent. Then, with the same precision he had shown throughout, he reached out and touched 2 points on the challenger's arms. The effect was immediate. Sensation and control flooded back into the challenger's limbs. He stumbled backward, his arms coming up instinctively to protect himself from an attack that never came. Lee had already turned away, walking back to his corner of the training space as if nothing had happened. The entire encounter, from the first evasion to the restoration of the challenger's motor control, had lasted 6 seconds. What followed was a silence that several witnesses described as oppressive. The challenger stood in the center of the space, his arms working perfectly now, but his face showing the shock of someone who had touched something beyond their understanding. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. Around the room, the other practitioners avoided eye contact, each processing what they had just seen in their own way. Finally, the challenger found his voice. "What did you do?" he asked, the question coming out smaller than intended. Lee, who had resumed his quiet stretching in the corner, looked up with an expression that witnesses described as neither triumphant nor apologetic. "You asked for light contact," he replied. "That was light contact." The implications hung in the air unspoken. If those gentle touches that had rendered a trained fighter helpless constituted light contact, what would full contact look like? The question was one that no one in the room wanted answered. The challenger, to his credit, didn't protest or make excuses. He simply nodded once and left the training area. According to those who knew him, he never spoke of the encounter publicly, though he also never again suggested sparring for fun with anyone. In the days that followed, those who had witnessed the encounter found themselves reluctant to discuss it, not because they had been asked to keep it secret, but because describing what they had seen made them sound like they were recounting a scene from a martial arts film rather than reality. The precise spots Lee had touched, the immediate effect on the challenger's motor control, the casual reversal of the technique, all of it seemed to belong more to legend than to a random afternoon in a training hall. Years later, when Lee's fame had spread globally and stories of his prowess had taken on mythic proportions, some of those witnesses would occasionally share their account of that 6-second encounter. Invariably, they would be met with skepticism. Critics would point out the lack of video evidence, the way memory tends to embellish over time, and the human tendency to transform the merely impressive into the impossible. And perhaps they were right. Perhaps what happened in those 6 seconds was less dramatic than memory suggested. But for those who were there, who saw the challenger's arms drop uselessly to his sides, who witnessed the fear in his eyes as he realized his complete helplessness, who watched Lee restore function as easily as he had removed it, there was no question about what they had seen. They had watched someone operate at a level of martial understanding that transformed a friendly sparring session into a demonstration of almost frightening precision. The lesson, if there was one, wasn't about the danger of challenging those whose abilities transcend normal understanding. It was about the nature of martial arts itself, the thin line between control and chaos, the difference between those who practice techniques and those who embody principles. In those 6 seconds, Lee had shown that true mastery isn't demonstrated through force but through such perfect understanding that force becomes unnecessary. Some would say the story grew in the telling, that 6 seconds became stretched into an eternity by the alchemy of memory and narrative. Others would argue that it was exactly as described, a moment when the veil between possible and impossible became permeable. The truth, as with many such encounters, likely lies somewhere in the shadowed space between fact and legend. What remains consistent in every account is the ending, the silence that followed, the absence of smiles in a room that had been filled with laughter moments before, the way everyone present seemed to reassess their understanding of what they thought they knew about combat, about control, about the nature of martial arts itself, and most of all the image of a man standing with his arms hanging uselessly at his sides, experiencing a helplessness that no amount of training had prepared him for. The encounter was never repeated. Word spread quietly through certain circles, and invitations for friendly sparring with Lee became notably rare. Those who had been present that day continued their training, but with a different quality of seriousness. They had seen what existed at the far end of the martial spectrum, and it had shown them how far they had yet to travel. In the end, perhaps that was the true lesson of those 6 seconds. Not about the danger of casual challenges, or the folly of testing legends, but about the depths that exist within any discipline for those willing to pursue mastery beyond the point where most would stop. It was a reminder that in the world of combat, as in many realms, there are levels of understanding that transform the very nature of what is possible. The challenger, according to those who kept in touch with him, continued to train, but he never again suggested sparring for fun. When asked why, he would simply shake his head and change the subject. Some experiences, it seemed, were better left unexamined. Some lessons, once learned, needed no repetition, and some encounters lasting only 6 seconds could cast shadows that stretched across a lifetime.